The Falcons got the juice now after trading for Rams wide receiver Van Jefferson.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Jace Medical. Empower yourself when you purchase a Jace case, providing you with a personal supply of 5 antibiotics that treat 50-plus infections. Get yours today at jacemedical.com. That's J-A-S-E medical.com. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Covered the Falcons for many years at falcfans.com, RIP. Right? People know me as Sirius Black, as Mr. Drew, and also as the Falcons Prophet. And we want to give a special shout out to the everydayers that make this illustrious podcast their first listen or first watch each and every day. All they got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So the Falcons traded for Van Jefferson today, right? They received Jefferson and a 7th-round pick from the LA Rams in 2025, and they give up a 6th-round pick to the Rams in 2025. And I like this trade because it brings some much-needed juice to this wide receiver core. And we talked about the Falcons trading for Van Jefferson at some point this spring. I want to say it was in March, right? I think it was probably the first time we talked about a DeAndre Hopkins trade, and we talked about how there were other receivers that were much more plausible trades for the Falcons, like Corey Davis, Hunter Renfrow, Tyler Boyd, and Van Jefferson was amongst that group. Now, the Prophet has returned, but, the Jefferson trade makes a little bit more sense now in hindsight, obviously, because he's in a contract here, like several of those other guys were, but he's on a rookie contract still, while those other guys are on the second contract. So he's much cheaper than those other guys are, right? And so this is kind of a low risk, medium reward type of bet for the Falcons, right? I say medium reward because Jefferson has the upside to be a good player, potentially a number 2 receiver, but I'm not going to say high reward because it's not as if like you're acquiring Justin Jefferson. Like when I saw the tweet, I thought Justin Jefferson, I thought someone was pranking me. And then I read it again and it was Van Jefferson. So like high reward would be that sort of thing. But, Van Jefferson never really emerged and lived up to his potential in LA, right? Last year was supposed to be his breakout year, where he was going to be the number 3 alongside Cooper Kupp and Allen Robinson, but things got off to a slow start because he suffered a knee injury during the summer. So he started out the year on IR, and by the time he came back midway through the season, pretty much the rest of the Rams roster was decimated. And so he didn't necessarily, wasn't able to put his best foot forward. And then this year with Cooper Kupp starting out the season injured, the expectations, I think, for a lot of folks was that he was going to be the go-to guy in that offense. And then Puka Nacua sort of became that guy. And then Tutu Atwell, of all people, after a quiet couple of seasons, kind of emerged as another option for them. And now that Cooper Kupp is back, Jefferson kind of tumbled down that depth chart, and maybe we'll get a better opportunity here in Atlanta than he was getting this past year in LA. So Jefferson's a player I liked. When I watched him ahead of the 2020 draft, I saw a player that I thought was a very good route runner, had good speed, good quickness. I thought would be a very effective slot receiver in the NFL. But unfortunately, because of playing with Cooper Kupp, he didn't really get many opportunities there. He was primarily more of a vertical threat in LA and was very effective and productive in that role. And so given that we've been spending the last, 4+ weeks talking about the Falcons needing more of a vertical threat in their offense, I think this is a great pickup for the Atlanta Falcons. Now, 2 other little side notes with Van Jefferson. He rejoins his former college teammate Kyle Pitts. They played together at Florida for a couple of years. Jefferson ran a 4.39 40 at the combine, so he does bring some of that juice, much needed juice. I wouldn't call him like a true burner, but certainly a guy that can run. And certainly brings a lot more juice than a lot of the other receivers outside of Scotty Miller here in Atlanta. The other little tidbit is there's a little bit of an Arthur Smith connection between Van Jefferson, because Van Jefferson is the son of former Falcons wide receiver Shawn Jefferson. You guys may recall Sean Jefferson played around 2000, from I think 2000 to 2002. Was productive when Chris Chandler was a quarterback, not so productive when Michael Vick was the quarterback. I think that's more of a Vick issue than a Sean Jefferson issue, but we're not going to get into that. But Sean Jefferson went on to be a very good coach in the NFL, was in Tennessee with Arthur Smith during the Wisenhunt years, I think, when Jefferson was the wide receivers coach. And Arthur Smith was still, I think, an assistant tight ends coach during that time. Jefferson's now the wide receiver coach in Carolina as part of that quote unquote all-star coaching staff that is so great that, Carolina remains the only winless team in the NFL. And of course, I got to throw some shade at our division rival when I get the opportunity. But because of that Sean Jefferson connection, this is a little bit of a homecoming for Van Jefferson, although I don't think he was born and raised in Atlanta or anything like that. If he did live in Atlanta, it was only for a couple of years. But, he probably did get a chance to see his dad play football here in Atlanta when he was a little kid. So somewhat of a homecoming for him. So we'll see sort of how quickly Van Jefferson gets up to speed here. My assumption would be it would take roughly a month for the Falcons to feel comfortable with him learning the offense. I think back to how long it took Wayne Gallman to learn the offense, and before the Falcons were comfortable playing Wayne Gallman, it took about a month after picking him up before they played him. And I would argue that probably playing wide receiver is probably a little bit more complicated than playing running back, or at least theoretically is harder to pick up the offense. But we'll see if the Falcons, wait that long, or they kind of sprinkle him in, get him a couple of, reps here or there between now and then over the next couple of weeks or something like that. So we'll see what he can do. But, I think the upside is there. Like, if all things go well, like, the Falcons may have just acquired their long-term number 2, right? That because Jefferson's only 27 and has that potential to be a quality number 2. Like, it could be Drake London and Van Jefferson as the team's 1 and 2 receivers for several years to come, if everything goes well. Right now, obviously, this could be another Bryan Edwards trade, and Van Jefferson does nothing here in Atlanta like Bryan Edwards did, in 21. Man, it's been so long. Was it? It was last year. It was 22 with Bryan Edwards. I'm sorry. Like, man, it feels so long ago. Feels like it was 2021 when we had Bryan Edwards. But so we'll see how that goes. But obviously, like, this is a player I've liked for several years. This is a player that I've had my eyes on as a potential Falcon for several months now. So I like this move a lot. And so we'll just see how it all works out. But there's some potential here. So definitely, I think people should be excited, and we'll just sort of have to wait and see if the Falcons can take advantage of Van Jefferson's skill set. And we'll get into the all 22 review of that week 5 win over the Houston Texans and talk about some of the things that Arthur Smith changed in the offense on that second series where the Falcons were able to go down the field and score a touchdown. And maybe Van Jefferson fits a little bit better if the offense looks more like that. And we'll break down exactly what I mean as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Our partners at eBay Motors have teamed up with Locked On Fantasy Football host Vinny Iyer to bring you some of the best fantasy picks each week, all season long. And whether you're prepping for the daily draft or scouting the waiver wire, every week we're going to provide you with players that are guaranteed fit on your roster. So let's see who Vinny has picked out for us on this week's eBay's Guaranteed Fit Fantasy Picks of the Week. And Baker Mayfield, to the surprise of many, myself included, has become kind of a borderline QB1 in fantasy this year and is enjoying his best and most efficient season as a quote-unquote reality quarterback as well. And with the Bucs coming off a week 5 bye, he should be able to pass for a high volume in week 6 against Jared Goff and the Lions at home. Mayfield has been locked on to a variety of receivers, and the Lions struggle to cover slot guys like Chris Godwin and tight end like Cade Otton. And since the Bucs won't be expected to run much against Detroit, it should lead to pleasing passing digits from Baker Mayfield. I had to pick up Baker Mayfield myself for one of my fantasy teams due to the Anthony Richardson injury. So Vinny and I are seeing eye to eye on this one. So now that Vinny has helped us win our fantasy championship, eBay Motors knows a championship team is about each player being a perfect fit. And the same is true with your vehicle. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you can make sure your ride stays running smoothly. From air filters, brakes, batteries, taillights, alternator shock struts, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Guarantee Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride the first time, every time, or your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash, baby. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. eBay Guarantee Fit, only available to U.S. customers, eligible items only, exclusions apply. So let's talk about that second series in the Houston game, which resulted in a touchdown. And that was the first quarter touchdown of the Falcons in 2023, and only the second time in Desmond Ridder's 9 starts now, where the Falcons have scored a touchdown in the first quarter. Right, Week 18, that Bucs game last year was the other time. But in looking back at it, I started to realize like it's not as if the Falcons were like fast starters under Mariota. If my count is not wrong, I think they only scored a first quarter touchdown 5 times in the 13 first quarters that Marcus Mariota started. And so we spent a lot of time talking about Desmond Ridder's tendency to start slow, but maybe this is an Arthur Smith issue, right? Because I didn't look it up, and I'm like, the Falcons are, 28th in the NFL in first quarter touchdowns since Arthur Smith's arrival back in 2021. So I'm like, that's interesting. But we're not going to get into that on today's episode, and we're going to hope that what we saw in this second series is a sign of a dawning of a new day for Arthur Smith. In that regard. So the Falcons come out on that second series in 11 personnel on the first 2 snaps. The first play, they hit Jonnu Smith on a play action pass for 13 yards. Then they run my much beloved shovel pass to Scotty Miller, and it's the best 3-yard gain I've ever seen. I absolutely love this play call. I was talking to the Locked On Falcons Discord over the weekend that basically I was said that if they don't use Scotty Miller as a vertical threat, which they're not, at least try to get his speed on the field as a horizontal threat to sort of stretch and stress defenses on jet sweeps and reverses. So this is right up that alley. And so I think you can build off of this type of play call in the future and give defenses something extra to think about, where you're faking the toss left and then you're having Miller motion to the right with the shovel pass. And so it puts defenses potentially in conflict. They, account for Miller's motion. That's one less defender to potentially deal with, a Bijan, that's going to be a problem for defenses. And if they overly commit to Bijan, then, Scotty Miller can do his thing. So I like seeing that play call, even if it only goes for 3 yards in the future. So then on the very next play, you go 13 personnel, 3 tight end sets, and you get a glimpse of the much hyped positionless football in that play, right? That Kyle Pitts is split out wide as a wide receiver. Jonnu Smith is lined up in the backfield as a running back. And then you run a reverse to Drake London that turns into a pass. No idea if that was the initial design of the play, but hey, the ends justify the means because you hit Jonnu Smith on a 22-yard explosive play. So we are happy with that result. And then you go back after that play to your standard heavy personnel again. 21 personnel, you hand it off to Bijan, you get 13 yards. And we've talked before about how Bijan and Keith Smith in the backfield as your 2 running backs in that 21 personnel is been a very effective combination for the Falcons. So I have no problem with the Falcons running those types of plays moving forward with their heavy personnel. You go to another heavy personnel grouping, 12 personnel, 2 tight end sets. You hand it off to Tyler Algier, you only get a yard. I don't think it's a coincidence that play doesn't work and Michael Pruitt's on the field. That's just me, but not a great look there. So 2nd and 9, after that modest gain, you dial up a flood concept and you hit Kyle Pitts for 16 yards. And we've talked before about Ridder's ability to hit certain concepts, dagger, smash, right? Now you add this flood concept, right? This has been a through line with Ridder. When we run these sort of high-low reads, right, where you're trying to put a single defender in conflict in the opposing defense's zone coverage, and Ridder can read that defender, and then based off of what that defender does, he can hit those throws. He's been able to consistently hit these concepts throughout the season. And when we talk about intentionality in the offense, play calling, right, where the defense is playing a certain zone and you're calling plays designed to attack that zone, that's what we mean by intentionality. And so more of this, please, because this is stuff that Desmond Ridder seems to be doing at a very high level. And then you finish off the drive on the very next play on a quarterback keeper, 11 personnel again, and the third wide receiver, Mac Hollins, in this case, is not really lined up as a wide receiver. He's lined up as an H-back / tight end. And then you sort of pull him, and he's sort of the lead blocker for Desmond Ridder, who walks in the end zone. And, Desmond, we gotta hold on to the football. It was almost a touchback. Got to hold on to the football. So we got to work on that ball security before we call any more, mobile quarterbacks sort of thing. But like to keep defenses guessing by utilizing Desmond Ridder's legs, especially in the red zone where it can be very effective. So I like seeing all these wrinkles. I like seeing the Falcons take advantage of some of their speed, some of their versatility, utilizing more 11 personnel, 3 wide receiver sets, taking advantage of Ridder's legs, putting a wide receiver at tight end, putting a tight end at running back. Again, positionless football, all that stuff, the creativity, the diversity that we've been sort of hyping up all offseason in this offense. This drive kind of had it all, right? And so I want to see more of this. Now, as the rest of the game progressed, the Falcons kind of went back to their standard, very heavy personnel, a lot of 12, a lot of 21 personnel stuff. And I won't even say like that was a mistake, although, it wouldn't be my preference, because like the Falcons were effective moving the football when utilizing that stuff, but then had some execution errors, turnovers, penalties, negative plays that grounded some of those drives where they were effectively able to move the football in those primarily heavy personnel groupings, grounded those drives to a halt. And so they weren't really able to come away with points throughout the rest of the game. But I would like to see the Falcons dialing up more of what we saw on that particular drive. We talked about wanting to see more 3 wide receiver sets in order to lighten the box so the Falcons could run more effectively. That wasn't really something that was effective in this Houston game, because in general, the Falcons weren't that effective running the football outside of a couple of heavy personnel groupings. But we talked about wanting to see like 30% or more 11 personnel for the Falcons moving forward, rather than like the 12% they had going into the week. I think now it's up to 14% based off of this game. They only use about 20% 11 personnel or 3 wide receiver sets in this game. But on this particular 7-play drive, 3 out of 7 is 40%. So I'm like, the more used, the better it looked, at least for one drive. So hopefully now that Van Jefferson is in the mix, the Falcons are moving more in that direction again, not expecting them to abandon the 21 or 12 personnel or that heavy personnel altogether. But again, maybe we're moving in that 30%, potentially 40% direction with the Jefferson acquire. So we'll talk more about Desmond Ridder's performances and the good and bad I saw from him, as well as talk more about how the Falcons have built their receiver core as we wrap up today's episode. But, if you want to see the plays that I just broke down, join the subtext, right? Subtext is great. You get a one-on-one conversation with me. You get insight that you don't necessarily get on the pod, right? You didn't have to wait until this episode to get my reaction on the Van Jefferson trade. You got it 20 minutes after that trade was first announced. You also get that one-on-one interaction with me. You get the feedback. It's basically like having my phone number, so you can provide whatever, talk to me about whatever you want to talk about, right? That weird mole on your back, you can talk about that if you want to, right? That's all available for you, subtext. But of course, the primary driver of that, maybe you should see a doctor, rather than texting me. But the primary driver is getting that extended all 22 review, where you can see all the plays that I just broke down on the second series in HD video. And all you got to do is join subtext. Is $4.99 a month, but you get a 14-day free trial. Just hit the link in the description below if you're curious. If you're not, join it. No fuss, no muss, that sort of thing. So we'll wrap up talking about Ridder's good decision making, as well as his accuracy concerns in this game, as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, Jace Medical provides you the Jace case, which includes 5 life-saving antibiotics for emergency use. And you're probably wondering, like, why do I need to stock up on antibiotics? Well, we live in a hectic world, guys, right? You never know when the next supply chain shortage or natural disaster or pandemic is going to hit. And so you don't want to be stuck without access to some of these life-saving medications. So it doesn't hurt to be more prepared now than ever. And I personally deal with sinus and ear infections a bunch. And Jace Medical makes it easy and simple for me to get access to these antibiotics. All you got to do is fill out a simple online form, and you potentially get these life-saving medications sent right to your door. Everyone should be empowered to care for themselves and their loved ones during the unexpected. So save more than $360 by getting these life-saving medications with Jace Medical, plus an additional $20 off by using the code locked on at checkout at jasemedical.com. It's JASE medical.com, promo code locked on. So let's talk about Desmond Ridder and his good performance. And I know we spent a lot of time talking about his bad performance. We're not going to spend as much time, I know, sadly, to some of you guys talking about his good performance, but I do think he played very well, right? He was more decisive. His decision-making was crisp in this game, which was my biggest complaint from the previous weeks, right? We talked about last week where it was like Arthur Smith was designing plays like to get the ball out quickly into the flat to the open receiver, and Ridder was hesitating. There was no hesitation on those types of play calls this week from Desmond Ridder. The only real knock on Desmond Ridder that I would have is the accuracy was a little scattershot at times. He was sailing a couple of throws. And it goes back to something we talked about after the draft with Desmond Ridder's accuracy concerns. And I thought, again, not being an expert on this, but I thought some of the times where he was asked to sort of speed up his delivery, get the ball out quickly, led to the accuracy being a little scattershot. And it seemed like that was the issue here in this Texans game, where a lot of the times where he was high on some of those throws were tight window throws where he was trying to put some little bit more zip on the ball to fit the ball into the tight window. So that was the only issue I had with Desmond Ridder's performance. Something to monitor, not something that we're going to make a mountain out of a molehill, right? I can live with Desmond Ridder spraying the football from time to time. You know, it was the poor decision making that was causing me to pull out my hair over the last couple of games, more so than that. So no real issues with his decision making in this game. So that is something that we can build off in the future. So we'll wrap up answering a YouTube comment from Deontay Watkins 1990. He asked, Aaron, can you help explain this, please? Now, when I watch tight ends like Travis Kelce and George Kittle, etc., I notice that they are wide open a lot, and they often have plenty of yak. And when your wide receivers and especially Kyle Pitts get the ball, when our wide receivers and especially Kyle Pitts get the ball, the defenders are on them immediately. They have almost no yak except for Bijan. What's going on there? So the main issue, Deontay, I think this is a great question. The main issue is, the certain routes that the Falcons are asking their receivers to run versus some of those other receivers, but without getting too in the weeds on, this route versus that route. And again, that's not really my area of expertise. Let's talk about how the Falcons have kind of built their receiver core around their tight end, especially Kyle Pitts. And let's talk about Travis Kelce for a second, right? Travis Kelce, primarily over the last 4-ish years, has been almost exclusively an underneath guy. Like most of his routes and targets are short and intermediate throws, right? And we know, and not quite the case this year, but we know in past years, the Chiefs had a very explosive receiver core. And the way that defenses defend teams is they don't want to give up. They focus on preventing the explosive play, and then they, build their defense from that. And so because they were so focused on preventing the Tyreek Hills and the Mecole Hardmans and all these Sammy Watkins and all these other guys from generating these explosive plays on all the vertical stuff that they were running in Kansas City, it basically meant that Travis Kelce as this underneath threat was just basically had all this room to do Travis Kelce things underneath. And that's why he's, he's been able to be as productive and do some of the things that you're talking about, Deontay, right? And it's not too dissimilar to how the Falcons, utilized Austin Hooper and Hayden Hurst when it was Julio Jones and Calvin Ridley here in Atlanta doing all that vertical stuff, and defenses were trying to account for that. And that gave those guys a lot of room underneath to do their work. And the Falcons haven't really built that wide receiver core here around Kyle Pitts. And frankly, I kind of think the Falcons have built their wide receiver core wrong, right? Now, Pitts has been primarily a deep threat, and that was especially true last year. It has continued this year, not to the same degree as it was last year. And I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with asking a tight end to be a deep threat. We saw Mark Andrews be very productive doing that in Baltimore. Gronk basically was a Hall of Fame, arguably the best tight end ever by basically being that seam stretching vertical threat. But when you look at the offenses that Gronk played in New England, right, it was a lot of receiver cores that featured underneath guys like Julian Edelman and Wes Welker, right? Complementary skill sets to what Gronk was doing. As the vertical threat, okay, you complement that with a short and underneath stuff. That's what the Chiefs did with Travis Kelce in their receiver core. That's what the Falcons did with Hooper and Hurst and our former receiver core. We don't really have that complementary skill set with Kyle Pitts, right? If you're going to ask Pitts to be that vertical threat, who are the underneath guys that are going to consistently win there, right? And so I've been thinking about this the last couple of weeks, thinking about Kyle Pitts' usage, and and I was thinking about how the Falcons have utilized Pitts quite a bit as an out wide receiver, right? Splitting him out wide like a wide receiver, and roughly about a third of his snaps going into this past Sunday were out wide. And it got me thinking about the player that I compared Kyle Pitts to when we drafted him. My eye-level comp for Kyle Pitts was Jimmy Graham, and he was another tight end that back in the day was split out wide a bunch. And I was curious to see is Pitts being split out wide just as much or more or less than Jimmy Graham? And I looked it up, and Graham's last 2 seasons in New Orleans in 2013 and 2014, he was split out wide about 20 to 25% of his snaps. So Pitts was getting more looks out wide than Jimmy Graham was. And I started digging deeper and looking at the Saints, and I noticed, like, okay, it was Jimmy Graham was one of their receivers, and Marcus Colston was their other primary receiver. And Marcus Colston's skill set is very similar to Drake London. And I'm like, why was it working for the Saints and not working for us with these two guys, these two types of players as their primary pass catchers? And obviously the difference in Drew Brees and Desmond Ridder and Marcus Mariota probably is the biggest factor in that. But I also noticed the types of skill sets that the Saints surrounded these two guys as the two pillars in their pass attack. And they brought in a bunch of fast guys: Robert Meacham, Joe Morgan, DeVary Henderson, Brandon Cooks, Lance Moore, Kenny Stills, right? And so you had these two bigger, slower, types of big pass catchers over the middle of their field. And then you surround them with a lot of fast guys, quick guys, vertical threats, and all that sort of stuff. Again, complementary skill sets, right? And you look at how the Falcons have surrounded Pitts in London, and they don't get that sort of complementary skill set. It's a lot of slow guys. It's Matt Collins, it's Brian Edwards, it's Auden Tate, it's Jonnu Smith, et cetera, right? And Jonnu Smith is fast for a tight end, but like he's not running by, NFL corners and whatnot. And so what was interesting is in this Houston game, Kyle Pitts spent less time split out wide. Less than 20% of his snaps against Houston were split out wide. And he wasn't also not being utilized primarily as a deep threat as much as he was. He had one 20-plus yard target, and it was only 20 yards in the air instead of all the vertical stuff that he's typically run. So the Falcons kind of used him against Houston more as a quote-unquote traditional tight end, right, rather than how they've used him in the past. And is it a coincidence that Pitts had his most productive game of the season? Again, we'll see. Time will tell. We need a larger sample size to draw stronger conclusions, but it does sort of lend credence to that idea that Pitts is better utilized as a traditional tight end than how the Falcons have utilized him in the month prior to this and in last year especially. And then when we look at the London Colston comparisons, right? Colston was a big slot receiver, spent most of his career, over 50% of his snaps playing in slot. We haven't really seen London get that type of usage in Atlanta. We saw last year about 20% of his snaps go in the slot. But what was noticeable is that London saw a vast increase in slot snaps at the end of last season once Pitts was hurt, that the Falcons primarily used London. And that was a big reason why London's production, like he was very productive slot receiver over those last 6 or so games. And that led to his production, his explosion in his production last year at the end of the season, where he was one of the more productive wide receivers in the NFL. Now, we haven't seen London utilized as much in the slot. It hasn't been a massive drop off, again, like 20% to like 17 or 16% or something like that. But you do wonder, is that a reason why London has not picked up where he left off last year, with less opportunities in the slot? And the thing that stood out to me is that he saw more snaps in the slot against the Texans than he had seen prior to this. 30% of his snaps came in the slot against Houston this past Sunday. Now, granted, he didn't catch any passes when he was in the slot. None of his targets were from the slot. So it wasn't that the slot directly had a correlation to him having arguably his most productive game. But it is notable to me that the Falcons seem like they're shifting away from how they've utilized both London and Pitts over the first month. Pitts less out wide, less deep stuff against Houston, improved production. More Drake London in the slot, improved production, right? And then you couple that with Kadero Hodge getting more snaps than Mac Hollins, Scotty Miller seeing increased snaps, and now you add Van Jefferson to the mix. It does feel like the Falcons are kind of moving away from the way that they've been building it, their receiver core, and adding more complementary skill sets to what Pitts and London do, and maybe utilizing Pitts and London in different ways that will allow them to continually to get better production out of those two guys. So time will tell on that issue, but it does give me some promise and some excitement that we will see more consistent and reliable production from this receiver core and Kyle Pitts moving forward. So I hope that answers your question, Deontay, right? That, I think we can see Pitts starting to look a little bit more like Kelce and like Kittle if we start changing the ways that we utilize them. But that is going to be the end of today's episode. Tomorrow will be crossover Thursday with Locked On Commanders. Continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check out Locked On NFL as your second listen. Join the subtext. That's it, guys. Link in the description below. Appreciate it. Till then.